Chag Matzah Shalom. In this study, I want to unpack the parable of the leaven. In Luke 13:20, Yeshua likens the kingdom of God to leaven, which a woman took and hid in 3 measures of meal till the whole was leavened. In the Old Testament, leaven represents mirth and joy. So on one hand, this is about the joy that those who enter into the kingdom experience. But of course, there's more to it than that. So let's examine the symbolism of leaven in the Gospels. In Matthew 16, verse 6, Yeshua tells his disciples to beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and of the Sadducees. And at first, his disciples don't understand what he is saying. But in verse 12, they realize that he is talking about the doctrine of the Pharisees and of the Sadducees. In Mark's account in Mark 8, verse 15, the Pharisees are still present, but the Sadducees have been replaced with Herod. And finally, in Luke's account, only the Pharisees are present. Luke adds the additional detail, though, that this doctrine is hypocrisy. The Greek word for hypocrisy means play acting. According to the Helps Word Study, it literally refers to someone acting under a mask. So this leaven that causes the kingdom to grow so quickly and rise higher than it normally would have is false doctrine. And since the Pharisees are present in all 3 accounts, this doctrine is spread predominantly by them. This makes sense, as in Matthew 23:15, Yeshua said they were extremely zealous in converting people to their false doctrine. Now, in the parable, the Greek word for took emphasizes the assertiveness of the receiver. This tells us that this leaven was intentionally placed into the dough with the purpose of polluting the final product. So the wheat had already been harvested, sifted, and processed before the leaven enters the dough. Yeshua also warns of this in Matthew 23:13, when he says that the scribes and Pharisees were turning away the people who were trying to enter into the kingdom of heaven. This parable tells us the scheme contrived by the Pharisees was to lead people astray by pointing them in the wrong direction, or telling them to climb up another way. This disinformation campaign was headed by someone acting under a mask to deceive. Yeshua speaks of such as wolves in sheep's clothing. Now, many claim the leaven of the Pharisees is legalism, which is defined as trying to keep the law by most who use this word. But this is false. Yeshua never speaks against or criticizes God's law in any way. He does, however, speak against lawlessness. And this is in fact what Yeshua blatantly accuses the Pharisees of in Matthew 23:28, when he says they appear righteous, but inside they are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. And also in Mark 7, where he accuses them of disposing of God's law to keep their own tradition. Leaven makes bread softer, fluffier, and overall more enjoyable and easier to consume. And the same is true of the leaven of the Pharisees. It brings great joy and immediate gratification to those who are deceived by it, because it disposes of the narrow path of God's law and promises another way into the kingdom. But in the end, this leaven will not be accepted by God. Once leaven is mixed into the dough, it cannot be separated back out. The only way to get unleavened bread from that point is to dispose of the whole batch of dough and start from scratch. The same applies to this false doctrine. Now let's contrast this parable with the parable of the mustard seed. The parable of the mustard seed represents slow but organic growth based on scripturally sound principles of sowing and reaping, as opposed to the fast inorganic growth brought about by the leaven. The mustard seed represents faith, and scriptural faith is not empty belief based on falsehoods. It is always deeply rooted and demonstrated by faithful obedience to God's law, not trying to find a way around it or rationalize why it no longer applies. This type of growth is attested to in Daniel 2, by the rock that becomes a mountain in Nebuchadnezzar's dream. So the Feast of Unleavened Bread is a time to feast on truth, as the true worshipers worship in spirit and in truth. This truth was given to Israel by God in the covenant he made with them after he judged all the false gods of Egypt and brought them out. And when all is said and done, the leaven of all other doctrines will be completely destroyed, and only this truth, along with the leaven of joy and gladness his true followers have in it, will remain. Thank you for joining me. Feel free to drop any comments, concerns, agreements, or disagreements in the comment section below. I hope that this study has blessed you and inspired you to search further into Yah's word. May Yahuwah bless you and keep you. May Yahuwah shine his face upon you and be gracious to you. May Yahuwah lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace.